What if I told you that, behind a simple trip to a well for water, lies one of the most provocative and mysterious scenes in the entire Bible? Imagine the sun blazing at the highest point in the sky, the desert heat cutting through the air, and a woman walking alone at a time when no one is usually there. At noon, the well is not a place for conversation or encounters. It's just a secluded, silent spot where the weight of loneliness echoes with every step. But for her, it wasn't just about quenching her thirst. It was about avoiding stares, whispers, and judgment. Have you ever been there? That moment when you prefer to hide from the world because you know people harbor more curiosity than compassion. Back then, water was fetched in the morning or late afternoon when the heat was bearable and the community gathered. Going at noon meant fleeing, and fleeing meant there was something to hide. The Samaritan woman carried more than a water jar. She carried a past that the entire town talked about. Stories that, even without confirmed details, spread like dust in the wind. And it is precisely in this unlikely setting that she encounters someone who not only breaks social rules, but also crosses seemingly insurmountable religious and cultural barriers. A Jewish man sitting alone at the edge of the well strikes up a conversation with her. That would be scandalous enough, but what comes next is even more surprising. He doesn't just talk, he sees her. He sees beyond her worn clothes, beyond her tired gaze, beyond her reputation. And this is where the story begins to take shape as an encounter that changes destinies. Have you ever been in the presence of someone who seems to read your entire soul without you saying a word? But before we get to the words exchanged, it's important to understand the weight of this scenario. Samaria was no ordinary place, and Samaritans and Jews didn't mix. There was mutual contempt, a deep division stemming from centuries of history and religious tensions. Therefore, every detail of this moment is charged with meaning. A Jewish man asking a Samaritan woman for water, alone, without witnesses, in the middle of the day, was not only unusual, it was dangerous to both their reputations. The sun reflected off the surface of the well, as if trying to illuminate secrets kept for years. The heat was increasing, but there was something else burning there, a tension that wasn't just physical, but spiritual, emotional, and perhaps even socially forbidden. And as she approached, it was impossible not to wonder what was going through this woman's mind. Was she calculating her answers, evaluating whether it was worth engaging in this conversation? Or perhaps, deep down, she sensed this encounter had a purpose that went far beyond the water she'd come to fetch. What you're about to discover may surprise you, because this isn't just a story about a woman and a Messiah. It's about the clash between prejudice and revelation, between shame and dignity, between isolation and mission. It's about how sometimes life brings us face to face with someone at the most unlikely moment, opening doors we thought were locked forever. Stay with me until the end, because what begins as a simple request for water will turn into a conversation that spans centuries, religions, and interpretations. And it is precisely at that moment, at the edge of the well, that the story begins to reveal itself, layer by layer, until it reaches a point of no return. And perhaps that is why this story spans generations with such power. Because deep down we've all had our well at noonday, that place or moment when we try to avoid eyes, hide scars, but suddenly, something or someone finds us right there, at the point where we thought we were invisible. It's in that moment that the biblical narrative ceases to be just an ancient text and becomes intertwined with our own lives. If this topic resonates with you, if in some way this image of a woman, alone, carrying her secrets and yet being found, has touched your heart or brought back memories, leave a comment below with what touched you most so far. It could be a feeling, a reflection, or even a moment in your life that this scene reminded you of. This is how we transform a video into a gathering of real stories, because your voice is also part of this conversation. And if you want more people to know this other side of biblical passages, uncut, uncensored, showing the strength, vulnerability, and power hidden between the lines, like this video. Every like helps this message reach further, bypassing algorithms and reaching those who might need to hear it today. If you'd like to continue this journey with us, exploring stories that have been silenced or forgotten, subscribe to the channel. This is where we'll open each page together, look between the lines, and discover what has long been overlooked. Your participation is what keeps this space alive and allows us to continue telling stories that deserve to be heard. And while you're thinking about that, let's go back to that scene, because what happens next in the well isn't just a conversation, It's a revelation that changes everything. She wasn't just the woman at the well, as tradition often describes her. Behind that clay picture lay a lifetime of untold stories, whispered encounters, closed doors, and choices that placed her on the edge of a social abyss. At that time, being a woman already meant being limited by rules imposed by men, but being a Samaritan woman carried an even heavier mark. It meant being on the edge of the religious map, seen as impure and unworthy by those who considered themselves guardians of truth. And even among her own people, she wasn't at the center. She lived on the margins of the margins. This position, paradoxically, both took away and gave her power. It took away the stability, the respect, and the security of a life approved by standards. But it gave her the rare freedom to cross lines other women wouldn't dare. Those placed outside the circle learned to survive with invisible resources, measured gestures, sharp words, the ability to read intentions before they are spoken. She didn't have a throne, but she knew how to move pieces like someone who understands that every decision is a chess game played in silence. Imagine the weight of living in a society where a woman's worth was tied to the name she bore, the man she belonged to, the reputation others created about her. And yet there she was, crossing the city at noon, deciding for herself the time and place she would go. There's a hint of rebellion in this gesture, a silent message that she wouldn't live to fit the mold they'd made for her. Perhaps she paid dearly for it, perhaps she lost more than she gained, but it's precisely at this point that her story begins to become fascinating. It's not about being perfect, but about surviving judgment and still maintaining her own voice. In those days, the line between survival and sin was as thin as a veil. A single woman could be accused of anything, and the absence of a defense was almost a sentence. Still, she carried on. She had no guards, no servants, no official alliances, but she had her own cunning, and in a culture where power and desire often conflated, that was as valuable as gold. Silence about her past might not be shame, but strategy. Because those who keep secrets maintain control over the narrative. There's a detail that's rarely mentioned. Women like her were well versed in the hidden dynamics that governed coexistence. They knew when to lower their eyes to avoid confrontation and when to hold their gaze to assert their position. They also knew that certain conversations in the shadows could change destinies more than decisions made in public squares. It's possible that, in the eyes of many, she was just another unimportant name. But in the underground network of influence and favors, she could have been a key player in alliances that never entered the official records. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding who she truly was requires looking at the world she lived in and the unwritten rules that shaped her every step. It's in this gray area, where official histories meet hidden truths, that we realize how a woman's role could extend far beyond what scribes were willing to record. 5 husbands. The phrase alone carries the weight of a scandal for any woman of the time, but for a Samaritan woman, it was practically a stigma tattooed on her skin. Ancient society didn't need evidence to form a judgment. The number was enough. It was as if each marriage, each breakup, was another brick added to the wall that separated her from ordinary life. But what did this number really mean? The truth is that, in the historical context, the possibilities are more complex and more disturbing than most imagine. The first hypothesis is the most obvious. Death, wars, illnesses and accidents were common, and short life expectancy meant that mourning and remarriage occurred at a rapid pace. But even if she had lost them all through tragic circumstances, that wouldn't erase the distrust society would cast upon her. For many, so many consecutive losses wouldn't be bad luck but a curse, and in cultures where spirituality and superstition intermingled, mere suspicion was enough to isolate someone. Another possible explanation involves divorce, and here we enter even more delicate territory. A man could repudiate his wife for trivial reasons, such as displeasing the seasoning of the food or not producing children. However, for a woman, breaking off a marriage required courage and risk. The act of leaving a husband or being left more than once was like publicly signing a confession of inadequacy, even if it was only a reflection of men who didn't deserve her. And there's the third hypothesis, the one many avoid mentioning, but which circulates between the lines of texts and oral traditions, relationships outside of marriage, perhaps not out of forbidden passion, but for survival, for silent alliances, for favors exchanged in the shadows. In a world ruled by men, sometimes the body and companionship were bargaining chips to secure shelter, food, or protection. She wouldn't be the first or the last woman to use what she had most readily available to keep breathing. 5 different men in one life wasn't just a marital statistic. It was a trail of decisions, losses, negotiations, and perhaps strategies that could only be understood by those who knew the inner workings of power and survival. It's possible that each of these men represented a phase, a turning point in her trajectory. Perhaps some tried to shape her, others tried to possess her, and a few perhaps truly loved her. But the fact that none remained speaks volumes about the instability of a life lived on the fringes of the norm. The most intriguing detail is that despite this history, she still managed to walk to the well with her head held high enough to hold a conversation with a stranger. And not just any stranger, but someone who would expose in a few sentences all these secrets. There was something about her that didn't fit the role of victim or villain. Perhaps it was this combination of resilience and mystery that made her so difficult to ignore. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding the weight of these 5 men is also understanding the subtle play between power and vulnerability, between reputation and survival, between the story that is told and the one that remains hidden. And then we come to the most uncomfortable detail of this story, the 6th man. He wasn't her husband. And this, in the mindset of the time, wasn't just a personal fact. It was a public mark, a heavy label that carried moral, spiritual, and social implications. There was no hiding it. In small villages, secrets were like spilled water. They always found their way. But what kept this relationship alive, even at the risk of condemnation? Here come 3 possible truths, and all of them are uncomfortable. The first is forbidden love. Perhaps there was something between them that transcended religious conventions and laws, a connection that required neither the permission of elders nor the blessing of a priest. Such loves have always existed, but in the ancient world, they were punished with the weight of exclusion and, in some cases, even life itself. To remain by someone's side in this scenario meant accepting life in the shadows, in a perpetual state of vigilance. The second possibility is the harshest and most practical, the need for survival. Without a formal husband, without an inheritance, and without a man to represent her before the community, a woman was vulnerable to abuse, poverty, and hunger. A partner, even without a formal title, could provide protection, shelter, and food. In this case, it wasn't a romance, but a functional alliance, almost an unwritten contract to stay alive. The third hypothesis is the most intriguing: social strategy. There are records of women who, unable to hold leadership positions, influenced political and family decisions through informal relationships. This 6th man could be a bridge to circles of power, a connection that allowed her access to information or favors that would otherwise be unattainable. In this scenario, every gesture, every encounter, every word could carry calculated weight, as if she were moving pieces on an invisible board. What we cannot ignore is that for a woman at that time, living in this condition was walking a fine line between freedom and ruin. The status of non-wife placed her outside legal protection, but also outside the constraints of certain obligations. It was a fragile life, but one that could offer a rare space of autonomy, provided she knew how to use it skillfully. And, by all indications, she did. What's most fascinating is that, in the encounter at the well, Jesus mentions this fact directly, almost surgically, without explicit judgment, but also without softening the truth. This moment breaks the barrier between what is public and what is private. He exposes a reality that many knew but few would dare to say out loud, and it doesn't escape. There's no record of justification, only the implicit acknowledgement that the truth spoken there was not an accusation, but a mirror. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because to understand the true meaning of this 6th man, we need to look at how unofficial relationships shaped dynamics of power and survival in ancient times, and how, even in sacred stories, what is whispered often reveals more than what is proclaimed in public. At that moment, the scene was enough to cause astonishment. A Jewish man, sitting alone at the edge of a well, strikes up a conversation with a Samaritan woman. To us, accustomed to the idea of casual encounters, this may seem trivial, but in the context of that time, it was an act charged with rupture and boldness. Jews and Samaritans had avoided each other for centuries, separated not only by beliefs, but by deep historical wounds. There were grudges, accusations of heresy, and disputes over the true place of worship. It wasn't just an invisible wall, it was a cultural one that no one crossed without paying a price. Furthermore, a man should not address an unknown woman in public, much less alone without witnesses. The mere act of speaking could generate dangerous interpretations, malicious insinuations, and questions about the honor of both. And yet, Jesus not only speaks to her, but leads the conversation directly, revealing intimate aspects of his life and offering something no man had ever promised before: living water. This dialogue is not a simple request for water. It is the opening of a symbolic negotiation where he offers something eternal in exchange for sincere attention. To understand the power of this gesture, it's important to remember that in Jewish culture, contact with Samaritans was seen as impurity. Drinking from the same vessel as one of them was, for many, like touching something contaminated. But by asking her for water, Jesus reverses this logic. He doesn't treat her as a risk to be avoided, but as a source that could offer him something. This role reversal is provocative, especially at a time when the woman already carried a past that placed her outside the norm. The impact of this goes far beyond the encounter itself. By breaking protocol, he is challenging an entire system, a system that classified people as worthy or unworthy, pure or impure, acceptable or disposable. He is showing, without needing to deliver a sermon, that the line between the sacred and the profane is not as rigid as religious leaders would have it appear. It is a shift in mindset, a demonstration that real transformation begins when one dares to cross the boundaries imposed by tradition. This scene, if looked at closely, is not only spiritual, it is also political and social. By interacting with her, Jesus recognizes her value despite all the cultural filters that tried to erase her. He places her at the center of a revealing dialogue, in which there is no audience but has historical impact. An encounter like this resonates not only in the hearts of those who lived through it, but in the generations who heard about it. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the weight of this breach of protocol requires looking at the hidden structures that governed life in the ancient Middle East and realizing how often true revolution happens not in great battles, but in seemingly simple conversations by the well. Comment below, what rule would you break if you knew it would change someone's destiny? When Jesus mentions living water at first glance, it seems like an innocent metaphor, a spiritual promise, wrapped in poetic words. But if we look more closely, we realize that the dialogue carries layers of meaning that go far beyond the obvious. In ancient culture, water was not just a physical resource, it was a symbol of life, purity, fertility, and renewal. Offering water, and especially living water, had almost ceremonial weight, evoking images of never-drying rivers, hidden springs, and the power to transform what was arid into something fertile. And by offering this to a woman who came alone to the well at a time when no one else was there, Jesus is not just speaking of religion, but of intimacy in the deepest sense of the word. This moment involves a subtle interplay of approach. He doesn't begin by accusing or imposing authority, but by offering something that awakens curiosity and desire. Not carnal desire, but that inner desire that stirs the core of the soul, that yearning for something never experienced before. This is where the dialogue becomes almost seductive, because it touches on the most intimate needs: thirst, fulfillment, transformation. He promises not only to alleviate the day's fatigue, but to satisfy an invisible hunger, a void that no relationship, no ritual, and no tradition had been able to fill. The thing is, for a woman accustomed to judgmental looks or ulterior motives, hearing an offer of something pure and eternal sounded disconcerting. Perhaps for the first time, someone was speaking to her about giving without taking anything in return. Yet, the very term living water could sound ambiguous. Water sources at the time were places of secret meetings, commercial exchanges, and even political negotiations. The metaphor could resonate both in the spiritual realm and in the more earthly imagination, awakening associations with freshness, pleasure, and renewal that went beyond religion. And in a way, that's the genius of the scene. The speech is symbolic enough to be universal, yet intimate enough to feel directed just at her. It's as if each word was tailored to touch something specific, an invisible turning point that could redefine her entire journey. There's, in this moment, an air of revelation that isn't shouted, but insinuated, like a hidden truth only perceived by those attentive to the subtext. If you think about it, it's this kind of approach that changes mindsets. It's not just about providing answers, but about provoking internal questions, awakening a good restlessness, the kind that makes people seek more. Living water isn't just a promise of salvation, it's an invitation to a transformation that requires crossing internal boundaries, breaking down walls built by years of pain and self-protection. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the meaning of this metaphor also means delving into how spiritual messages and elements of symbolic seduction blend together in ancient texts, revealing a rich background of nuances that is rarely discussed openly. Comment below. What word has completely changed the way you saw something? Until now, she had been the character carrying questions, suspicions, and scars. But at an almost imperceptible point in the dialogue, something shifts. It's as if the woman who walked to the well under the weight of her history stopped defending herself and began to open herself to something she had never experienced. Her gaze, previously sharpened by the need to protect herself, now became a fertile field to receive what was being sown. The turning point didn't come with a visible miracle or a theatrical gesture, but with the precise revelation of her life, spoken by someone who couldn't possibly know. And in that moment, there was no denying it. She was facing something that broke down all the barriers she knew. What's fascinating is how this shift in attitude isn't limited to her inner self. The woman who, moments before, avoided contact with the community, now runs toward the village to speak to the very people who judged her reputation. It's almost a counterintuitive move. Those who are stigmatized normally keep quiet to avoid further exposure, but not her. Perhaps because for the first time, she possessed something so valuable that it outweighed the weight of any label. Upon entering the village, she doesn't present herself as a victim, nor as someone who has finally been vindicated. She speaks as a witness, and the tone isn't one of imposition, but of invitation. Come see a man who told me everything I've ever done. There's no self-promotion, but there's an almost visceral urgency to share. The effect is immediate. People who previously saw her only as a marginalized figure now follow her, driven by curiosity and the magnetism of her transformation. This is the power of a genuine revelation. It doesn't need a rehearsed speech because the change is visible, and most intriguingly, by becoming a messenger, she gains something she didn't seek: authority. Not the institutional kind legitimized by titles and positions, but the authority that arises from direct impact on people's lives. The same woman who went to the well at the most unlikely time now mobilizes the village in broad daylight. It's a contrast that, in itself, reveals a lot about human potential when there's a shift in mindset. This turning point is also a reminder of how certain encounters, however brief, can redefine entire trajectories. It's not just about receiving a spiritual message, but about discovering that your voice still had value, that it could generate movement, that your story, with all its flaws and scars, could serve as a bridge to something greater. Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because understanding this transformation isn't just about faith, but about how the courage to expose one's own truth can break down walls that years of isolation have built. It's about realizing that sometimes what we try hardest to hide is precisely what will open doors to our liberation. Between the image of sinner and messenger lies a territory few dare to explore. It is in this space between the label imposed by society and the calling that transforms that the woman at the well begins to walk. The Bible is full of female characters who inhabit this zone of tension, women whose stories carry contradictions, whose choices challenge the morals of their time, but who nevertheless become essential pieces in the plot of Revelation. This woman joins this list not because she lived according to standards, but precisely because she broke with them and yet was used as an instrument for something much greater. What makes her fascinating is that she wasn't purified before being sent. She was sent still carrying the weight of what the community would call sin. This is a paradigm shift that still bothers us today. It's expected that to become a spokesperson for a divine message, one must first rid oneself of all traces of an irregular past. But in her case, what qualified her was not a resume of virtues, but rather the lived experience of being found in the midst of history itself. in the exact state in which she was. This reveals a hidden truth about how sacred narratives work. Purity is not a prerequisite for mission, but mission can become the process of transformation. It's as if human frailty itself is used to amplify the message. The contrast between who she was and what she went on to do makes the impact impossible to ignore. And by being recognized, not for what she did wrong, but for what she witnessed, she rewrites how her name will be remembered. This tension between sin and mission also exposes the discomfort of religious structures that attempt to control who can and cannot speak in the name of the sacred. Characters like this break the mold. They are not docile, they do not follow the liturgy as expected, and they are not afraid to cross the boundaries designed to keep them out. What they do is cross these boundaries, and in doing so, they prove that spiritual authority is not granted by human approval, but arises from a direct encounter with truth. What's most provocative is realizing that, in the biblical record, figures like her are not isolated exceptions. They form a silent network of women who, coming from unlikely backgrounds, end up playing roles that change the course of kingdoms, influence decisions, and bring about lasting transformations. What at first glance seems like a contradiction is actually the key to understanding that the sacred doesn't always choose the cleanest path, but the most effective. Now, I want to go even deeper into this topic, because when we understand that these female figures deliberately occupy the space between what is condemned and what is called out, we begin to see how the official narrative often softens or hides the true impact they had. The hidden power of women in the Bible rarely appears on the surface of the text, but it is there, shaping decisions, changing destinies, and even altering the course of entire kingdoms. It is a power that is not imposed by physical force or titles, but rather operates behind the scenes, between the lines, often disguised as submission. The woman at the well fits into this lineage of female figures who, even when judged or marginalized, managed to move decisive pieces on the chessboard of sacred history. Just look at names like Esther, who saved an entire people without lifting a sword, but by mastering the art of speaking at the right moment and to the right person. Or Ruth, whose loyalty and strategic intelligence put her on the path to becoming part of the royal line, despite being a foreigner. There's also Rahab, who, with a gesture of protection from Israelite spies, rewrote her own history and became an ancestor of kings. None of them were chosen according to the religious standards of the time, and yet they all left profound marks. This pattern reveals something disturbing. Female power in the Bible is almost always indirect, but rarely small. It infiltrates where male power cannot reach, navigating spaces that only those underestimated can traverse unnoticed. Often, this power is linked to the ability to perceive truth before it is proclaimed, to influence decisions at the very moment they can still be changed. It is a silent influence, but lethal to any system that attempts to control it. In the case of the Samaritan woman, her transformation into a messenger broke down ethnic and religious boundaries. She not only recounted her experience, but also mobilized men and women to leave their homes to see for themselves. This is a political, social, and spiritual act, even if it isn't recorded in these words. The official narrative may attempt to downplay her role, but the fact remains that she was the connecting link between a Jewish Messiah and an entire Samaritan community, something no religious leader had achieved until then. If we look closely, we'll see that these stories form a kind of underground network of female power, a tapestry that spans centuries. It's as if each of them left a thread, and together these threads form a fabric that sustains part of the biblical story without ever being openly acknowledged. And perhaps it's precisely this lack of official recognition that makes this power all the more fascinating, because it has survived censorship and selective interpretations. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this hidden power is recognizing that the Bible is not just a record of obedience and faith, but also a document filled with power struggles, unlikely alliances, and feminine strategies that changed the course of the sacred narrative. What this story still hides is precisely what most troubles comfortable interpretations. The woman at the well was not just an example of personal conversion, but a figure of rupture, someone who challenged the power structures of her time simply by existing outside the mold, and yet becoming the messenger of something great. Modern sermons often prefer to soften her image, transforming her into a docile supporting character. ignoring the fact that she broke social protocols, challenged religious boundaries, and publicly embraced a truth that most would fear to touch. It's easier to present her as the repentant sinner who bowed down than as the strategic, conscientious, and fearless woman who returned to the city to influence an entire community. There's also silence regarding the provocative tone present in her conversation with Jesus. She questions, confronts, and maintains a dialogue that isn't one of blind submission, but rather of exchange. This is rare in narratives of the time, especially when the interlocutor is a man, and even more so when that man is Jewish and she is a Samaritan. To ignore this layer is to miss the point that courage isn't just about facing declared enemies, but also about sustaining a conversation that challenges entrenched mindsets. Perhaps what's most often overlooked is her social impact. The biblical text reports that many believed because of the woman's word, a powerful statement, but one that receives little attention. In other words, she was the link between a revolutionary message and an entire community. And this happened not through visible miracles or fiery speeches, but through the credibility that sprang from her own experience. This story forces us to think about identity more broadly. The woman at the well didn't erase her past to fit the role she was given. She used it as proof of transformation and as a tool to build something new. This challenges the idea that we need to be ready or clean to fulfill a mission. It shows that often what we consider our greatest burdens can actually be the element that opens doors and breaks down barriers, and perhaps that's why certain details are left out, because they force us to rethink what we understand by purity, leadership, and even obedience. The woman at the well didn't follow a manual but followed the truth she found, and that in any era is profoundly subversive. Now, I want to go even deeper into this subject, because understanding why these layers were softened leads us to question who decides what gets told and what gets erased, and what interests lie behind these choices. If you've made it this far, you've already realized that this story holds much more than what's typically told, and it's precisely this kind of conversation, full of layers and revelations, that I want to continue bringing you. So if it resonated, if it somehow provoked you to look between the lines more closely, subscribe to the channel. That way, we can continue this journey together, exploring stories that have remained in the shadows. To let me know you stuck it out, leave a comment saying, "I followed through to the last drop." It's a simple way for me to know you were with me every step of the way, and as a bonus, to see who else is part of this community that loves to go beyond the surface. And since we've built this connection, please leave a like too. It's not just a button, it's a way of showing that this space is worthwhile, and that this type of content needs to continue. There's a video here that expands on this topic and delves even deeper into the hidden truths we only discover when we look closely. Click through and follow me there.